They called him the quiet Beatle, calm, reserved, the one who stayed out of the spotlight. But when Yoko Ono walked into the Beatles' inner circle, George Harrison was the first to break his silence. Long before the band crumbled, he saw the cracks forming and didn't hold back. He warned John. He challenged Yoko. While the world fixated on Lennon and McCartney, it was George who sensed the storm coming. And what he said changed everything. This is the moment George Harrison realized it was over, and why no one listened. He saw the end coming before anyone else. During the chaotic Let It Be sessions, something inside George Harrison finally snapped. On January 10, 1969, after a tense lunch break, he stood up, spoke just 5 quiet words, "See you, round the clubs," and walked out. That simple sentence carried the weight of everything he had held back. George knew it was over. The magic was gone, and he knew exactly who had helped tear it apart. But to understand why George felt the way he did, we have to go back to the beginning, to a freezing little house in Liverpool where it all started. Born on February 25, 1943, in a cramped home at 12, Arnold Grove in Wavertree, Liverpool, George Harrison entered a world defined by struggle. The house had no central heat, just one small coal fire to fend off the bitter cold, and the only toilet was outside in the yard. Like many working-class families in post-war Britain, hardship was part of everyday life. Liverpool itself still bore the wounds of German bombings, with rubble and scars from the Blitz around every corner. Yet even in that grey, battered city, George found his first spark of something bigger, a love for music that would one day shake the world. Families like the Harrisons lived through rationing well into the 1950s. Every loaf of bread, every drop of fuel, every scrap of clothing was precious. George Harrison grew up in a world where nothing came easy, a world defined by cold nights, modest meals, and quiet resilience. But instead of hardening him, those early struggles forged a deep sense of humility and inner strength that would remain with him long after the spotlight found him. Even as he rose to global fame, George never lost the grounded spirit shaped by those early days of survival. Yet there was something remarkably different about George's upbringing, something mystical, almost prophetic. While she was pregnant with him, his mother Louise became captivated by Indian culture. In the heart of post-war Liverpool, while others tuned into local stations, she was listening to Radio India, absorbing the hypnotic sounds of sitars, tablas, and a faraway spirituality. It was unheard of in their working-class neighborhood. But in that small home filled with static and wonder, Louise unknowingly planted a seed in George's soul, one that would grow into a lifelong spiritual journey and set him apart from every other Beatle. Long before George Harrison ever met Ravi Shankar or stepped foot on Indian soil, the East had already begun to shape his soul. It wasn't by accident, it was his mother, Louise, whose quiet fascination with Indian culture planted a spiritual seed in him long before fame found him. Her curiosity became his compass. The sounds of distant sitars and meditative rhythms played softly in his childhood home, whispering to a boy who didn't yet understand how deeply those vibrations would guide his future. Then, when George was just 12 or 13, a single moment shattered the ordinary. He was riding his bike through his Liverpool neighborhood when he heard Elvis Presley's "Heartbreak Hotel" pouring out of a neighbor's window. That song didn't just catch his ear, it electrified his entire being. Rock and roll wasn't just music, it was liberation. In that instant, George didn't see a grim future of factories and cold mornings. He saw guitars, stages, and the power to break free from the life he'd always known. It was the spark that lit the fuse, the first step in his journey to becoming one of the greatest musicians the world has ever known. From then on, he had little interest in school. He struggled academically at the Liverpool Institute. George was occupied with learning something more significant, even if his teachers would have noticed his failure. He immersed himself in Buddy Holly, Little Richard, and Carl Perkins songs. He was attracted to Buddy Holly's deft guitar work, Little Richard's untamed fire, and Perkins's rockabilly twang. George was studying how to use 6 strings to create magic while other children were learning information by heart. He was not hindered by his low grades. They shoved him ahead. He scraped up enough cash by the age of 14 to purchase a Zenith Acoustic, which was his first guitar. He repeatedly listened to albums and copied what he heard in order to teach himself how to play. He had no fancy professors or lessons. Rather, he was determined. He played till his fingers ached, learning techniques and chords that would later enable him to alter the course of music. He wasn't merely a fantastic musician because of his teenage commitment. It gave him the confidence to experiment with new sounds, such as the sitar, which no other rock musician was using. Another life-altering incident occurred at the age of 14. At the Liverpool Institute, he got to know Paul McCartney. Paul was 15 years old. Their mutual appreciation of the new American rebellious music led to their friendship. George kept to himself and concentrated on the guitar. Paul was creative and gifted. They had a hope of an alternative future. Paul introduced George to John Lennon within a year, and that uncomplicated friendship turned into the beginning of a life-altering event. At the age of 15, George became the lead guitarist with the Quarrymen in March 1958. Although John Lennon founded the band, George contributed fresh talent and vigor. At a bus audition, he dazzled John by playing the challenging instrumental Raunchy. George was younger than the others, but his skill more than compensated for it. His presence influenced the band's sound and put them on the course to become the Beatles. Between 1960 and 1962, Hamburg, Germany, served as the actual test. The band performed in gritty bars with boisterous crowds for hours every night, often for as long as 8 hours. They barely had enough money to eat and lived in cramped, windowless apartments below the theater. Although it was a harsh experience, it strengthened them. They became a tighter band and understood how to work a crowd. They were prepared for anything by the time they returned to Liverpool. Fans were taken aback by their decision in 1962. Their drummer, Pete Best, was fired. The group felt he didn't quite belong, but it wasn't an easy decision. They added Ringo Starr, who gave their music a fresh energy. The final piece of the puzzle was in place, and the iconic Fab Four was complete with Ringo on drums. America would never forget what happened on February 9, 1964. The Beatles entered the Ed Sullivan Show stage. And they made all the difference in that instant. George Harrison, Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, and John Lennon were no longer just 4 young Liverpool men. They turned into myths. 73 million people watched them that evening. In other words, over 60% of all TVs in America were switched on to watch them. At the time, it was the largest television event the nation has ever witnessed. Even though there were only 728 seats available, CBS received 50,000 ticket requests. The desire to be a part of history was strong. 5 songs were performed by the Beatles. The audience erupted when they sang I Want to Hold Your Hand. In the studio were even Vice President Richard Nixon's daughters. President Kennedy had died only months earlier, and the entire nation was still in shock. Joy was delivered by the Beatles. They offered hope. It was more than just music that evening. Something fresh was beginning. The nation was engulfed in Beatles fever. The invasion by the British had started. The Beatles did something that no one else had ever done by April 4, 1964. At the same time, they occupied the top 5 positions on the Billboard Hot 100 list. Can't Buy Me Love came in first. Twist and Shout came in second. She Loves You came in third. I Want to Hold Your Hand came in at number 4. Please Please Me was number 5. 34 Beatles songs reached the Hot 100 in that year alone. Number 1 was reached by 6 of them. Not only were they at the top of the singles chart. Meet the Beatles is one of their albums. Additionally, the Beatles' introductions ranked top and second on the album list. They own half of America's top 10 tunes for a week. For nearly 60 years, no one came close. And it was during the streaming era in 2021 that someone eventually tied the record. The Beatles had achieved this through the sale of recordings. That week demonstrated that they were not only well-liked but also unstoppable. Quiet One's George Harrison discovered his voice in 1963. He wrote "Don't Bother Me" when ill in a Bournemouth hotel room. It meant the world to him, even though he described it as a pretty bad song. It demonstrated his writing ability. The song appeared on Meet the Beatles in the United States and With the Beatles in the United Kingdom. It had a distinct sound from the tunes of McCartney and Lennon. Moodier and darker. Despite being a tiny step, it gave George the confidence to continue writing. He would give the world something one day. His songs were often ignored, even though My Guitar Gently Weeps shows how difficult it was for him to be a member of the Beatles. Harrison only had 2 or 3 tunes on most albums. He had composed so many songs by the late 1960s that he showed producer Phil Spector literally hundreds of them. Beatles records didn't include hits like Isn't It a Pity and All Things Must Pass. He was stuck. It was like being constipated, he claimed, waiting for his tunes to be heard. It got to be too much during the Let It Be sessions. He left. It was different when he returned. What he had long suppressed was ultimately revealed to the public in his 1970 album All Things Must Pass. George stood out for many reasons than only his music. While filming Assistance in 1965, it was the sitar he heard first. He found it fascinating. He purchased one and applied it to wood from Norway. Everything changed because of that music. The sitar made its debut in Western pop music. It had a fresh, enigmatic sound. It was imitated by several bands. Before long, you heard sitars in Donovan, the Rolling Stones, and the Byrds songs. George's inexpensive Oxford Street sitar rose to fame. It brought almost $53,000 at auction in 2024. A whole new musical realm had been made accessible by the sitar. George's life was further altered in 1966 when he met Ravi Shankar. George was a Liverpool rock star. An esteemed Indian master was Ravi. Despite coming from separate worlds, they had a strong bond. George's commitment to learning was evident to Ravi. George witnessed Ravi's wisdom and spirituality. George desired to relocate to India and pursue full-time education there. Few outsiders had ever been able to swiftly become Ravi's student. Together, they visited India. George discovered that it would require years of consistent practice to become proficient on the sitar. But they became closer. He learned about the soul, life, and music from Ravi. George took the Beatles to India in 1968. To practice transcendental meditation, they stayed in an ashram in Rishikesh. Peace was what they want. They sought clarification. In a matter of weeks, they wrote 48 songs there. However, tension began to build. Lennon grew agitated. They were worn out by the rigid regimen. They were at their most inventive on the trip. But also the start of the band's demise. Then the scandal broke out. They were instructed by a Maharishi who was accused of approaching ladies at the ashram. Lennon was enraged. "What have you done?" he wrote to Maharishi, and they left India infuriated and wounded. Lennon changed the song's title to Sexy Sooty. George was conflicted. Despite his disillusionment, he continued to believe in meditation. The band was indelibly altered by the experience. George delved further into Krishna consciousness after India. Every day, he chanted Hare Krishna. He made the chant more widely known. He created the Hare Krishna mantra in 1969, and it peaked at number 12 in the UK. My Dear Lord, his hit was a prayer. Millions were donated to the Krishna movement by him. In the Beatles, George Harrison had always been the quiet one. However, he took a risky step in 1968 that completely altered the situation. While My Guitar Gently Weeps is a song he penned. After reading the etching, he had the notion. He was depressed about the friction within the Beatles and the absence of love in the world. He thought his songs were not taken seriously. He then took a startling action. Superstar guitarist and close friend Eric Clapton was asked to play lead guitar on the song. On their records, the Beatles hardly ever allowed outside musicians to perform. However, Clapton's presence forced Paul McCartney and John Lennon to pay attention this time. The studio's mood shifts. The September 1968 recording become a gem. Harrison's eerie lyrics and Clapton's solo made it one of the Beatles' best tunes. It demonstrated to the world that Harrison possessed the same level of brilliance as McCartney and Lennon. However, the band's internal dynamics continued to deteriorate. Harrison hit his breaking point during the Let It Be sessions on January 10, 1969. He had had enough of the Twickenham Studios rehearsals after a morning. He was driven over the edge by Paul's domineering behavior, John's distancing, and Yoko Ono's persistent presence. He got into a furious quarrel after lunch. After saying, "See you around the clubs," he got up and left. The Beatles made an effort to continue without him. They even made a joke about replacing him with Eric Clapton, but it was obvious that the band was having trouble. That afternoon, the studio turned into an odd environment. Yoko sang while they jammed aimlessly. The Beatles didn't seem like the same band anymore. Harrison penned Wah Wah at home the same day. His bandmates were giving him headaches, which was satirized in the title. The pressures and artificial smiles he felt stuck in were blasted by the song. He used it to express that he was tired of the bullshit. In 1970, it was the first song he laid down for his solo album, All Things Must Pass. It was a massive recording. It featured members of Badfinger, Clapton, and Ringo Starr, together with a loud sound that overpowered any recollection of the Beatles. His independence and rage were encapsulated in the song. Harrison made demands when he rejoined the Beatles. He informed them that they needed to record at Apple Studios and leave Twickenham. He desired a new, more laid-back method of working and an end to the discussion of live performances. The band concurred. Due to his circumstances, they were able to complete Let It Be and even perform the well-known rooftop concert as their final performance. But the fissures were visible to all. Harrison's demands were the only way for the Beatles to continue. Harrison eventually received the attention he was due later that year. The first Harrison standalone single was his song, Something. On the Abbey Road album, it was on the same disc with Lennon's Come Together. Something was pure and lovely, inspired by his wife, Pattie Boyd. It is the best love song of the last 50 years, according to Frank Sinatra. Both critics and fans concurred. Tensions continued to rise despite Harrison's demonstration that he belonged at the top, right next to Lennon and McCartney. Regarding Yoko Ono, Harrison had been truthful from the beginning. He informed her that she gave off a negative aura and had a bad reputation in New York. Harrison said it directly to her face, as John Lennon later acknowledged. Harrison had not been mean. He was expressing what many people believed but were afraid to express. The biggest rule of the Beatles was broken by Yoko. There are no spouses or girlfriends in the studio. While they worked, she sat next to John and whispered to him. Paul joked about it in an attempt to keep the conversation light. Harrison, however, was more affected. She had altered their relationship and their space. It was all captured in a single, brief instant. Yoko stole a biscuit from Harrison's speaker cabinet during the Abbey Road sessions. He blew up. "That bitch," he shouted out. Everybody froze. The biscuit wasn't the point. Harrison believed that Yoko's appearance was the last straw since it was about boundaries, respect, and how much had changed. It was short, but it said it all, LFT the Beatles. He wrote that in his diary on the day he left the band in January 1969. He had lost his favorite band. There was no longer the close-knit gang of Liverpool boys. The Beatles were no longer as good as they once were. Even though the others weren't ready to confront it yet, Harrison could see it clearly. The subsequent events were very devastating. George Harrison had waited in silence for years as everyone's attention was drawn to Lennon and McCartney's tunes. He and the others hurried to distribute songs that had been kept in lockup now that the Beatles were over. People were particularly awed by George's music. He finally revealed to his fans how much he had been keeping to himself. His talent, which had previously been concealed, suddenly became evident. George brought in Phil Spector to assist him in developing his new song. Spector's wall of sound, a multi-layered, lush recording technique that filled every room with music, made him famous. They collaborated on All Things Must Pass, George's solo album. George's straightforward tracks were transformed into huge, impactful tunes by Spector. They added thunderous percussion, choirs, and strings. Members of Badfinger and celebrities like Eric Clapton were featured on the record. People realized George had discovered his genuine voice and was no longer just the silent Beatle when they heard songs like My Sweet Lord and What Is Life. All Things Must Pass was one of the first triple albums of its kind when it was released in November 1970. There were over 20 tracks on it. The music was profoundly spiritual, passionate, and rich. It was praised by critics as being superior than a lot of the Beatles' last work. The CD demonstrated to the world that George was a self-made genius. It is still regarded as one of the Beatles' best solo compositions. My Sweet Lord became quite popular. In 1970, it became the first Beatles solo to reach the top of the charts in the United States. But there were problems with its success. George was sued by the publisher of the 1963 hit song, He's So Fine, who claimed that George had stolen their music. The judge concluded after years of litigation that George had unintentionally duplicated it. George paid $587,000 to resolve the matter in 1981. Later, in a song titled This Song, he made fun of it. George believed that the message of My Sweet Lord was more important than the case, despite the fact that the entire experience was agonizing. George demonstrated his affection in another way as well. He and Ravi Shankar performed for Bangladesh on August 1, 1971. Madison Square Garden hosted 2 performances in a single day, drawing 40,000 spectators. That day, they raised almost $250,000, and album and movie sales brought them millions more. It served as the model for subsequent charity concerts like Live Aid and was the first large rock concert. George demonstrated the world-healing power of music. However, his private life was collapsing. George's involvement with Ringo's wife, Maureen Starkey, surprised his closest friends. In 1965, Maureen married Ringo. She was frequently visiting George's house now, in the early 1970s. George's wife, Pattie Boyd, saw them together one evening behind a locked door. George laughed from within as she pounded on the door. He pretended everything was okay when he opened it. According to Pattie, she realized her marriage was over at this point. At a dinner party, things deteriorated. The room went dead when George said to Ringo, "You know, Ringo, I'm in love with your wife." After running, Maureen locked herself in the restroom. John Lennon later referred to it as incest. Heartbroken, Ringo could only remark, "Better you than someone we don't know." The sense of betrayal was that intense. The Beatles' brotherhood had fallen apart. George informed Pattie that he wanted a divorce on New Year's Eve 1974. An agonizing year came to a tragic end. Although Pattie and Ronnie Wood had already begun dating, George's termination of their relationship was extremely painful. In 1977, the divorce was finalized. Following the Beatles, George Harrison's life was a path of dangers, heartache, victories, and near tragedies. He established Dark Horse Records in 1974 in an attempt to realize his goal of promoting up-and-coming artists. He desired to manage his own music while assisting musicians such as Splinter and Ravi Shankar. However, it wasn't simple. The label's initial agreement with A&M Records ended. A&M sued Harrison for $10 million and severed connections when he missed a crucial record deadline due to hepatitis. Only Splinter's song, Costafine Town, became a moderate hit, which was a tremendous loss considering that $3 million had already been spent on Darker's musicians. Harrison hurried to join with Warner Brothers in time for his album 33 and 1-3, but he had to return a $1 million advance. In 1978, what began as an optimistic endeavor to help others became a difficult lesson about the music industry. Harrison displayed his kindness and bravery to the globe. The cancellation of Monty Python's Life of Brian was on the verge of happening when EMI Films abruptly withdrew. Harrison prevented that from occurring. To raise $3 million, he launched Handmade Films by taking out a mortgage on his cherished property in Friar Park. He quipped that he only did it because he was eager to see the film. The gamble paid well. Approximately the US alone, Life of Brian brought approximately $21 million. Time Bandits and With Nail and I, two of Britain's most beloved cult films, were made by hand. Harrison's leap of religion helped keep British cinema at a time while it became suffering. His private life was simply as dramatic. Harrison married Pattie Boyd in 1966 after assembling her on a hard day's night, however their relationship cracked underneath the burden of repute, infidelities, and his non-secular quests. His close buddy Eric Clapton fell deeply in love with Boyd, writing Layla about his yearning for her. When Boyd in the end left Harrison in 1977 and married Clapton in 1979, it could have destroyed their friendship. Rather, Harrison attended their wedding ceremony and even joked approximately being their husband in regulation. Boyd became the muse at the back of songs like Harrison's Something and Clapton's Layla and Tremendous Tonight. The letters they wrote to her sold for over $3.6 million in 2024, showing just how a whole lot their tale still fascinates humans. Because the years surpassed, Harrison struggled to shape the achievement of his former bandmates. His albums in the mid-70s did not impress critics or sell well. He becomes seen as the quiet Beatle who no longer healthy in. Contamination and exhaustion all through his 1974 tour left his voice hoarse and his album Dark Horse turned into Rush and poorly acquired. Harrison pulled far from the spotlight and centered on movie and private tasks. It wasn't till the touring Wilburys in the past due 80s that he honestly determined his footing again. Harrison's voice by no means absolutely recovered. Smoking and years of strain broken his throat. His 1974 tour changed into mainly painful. Laryngitis left him suffering to sing and his critics were harsh. The years of performing took a toll and in 1997 he became identified with throat cancer. He beat it at first but most cancers observed in 2001 spreading to his mind. Even as his fitness failed, Harrison stayed wonderful. He told his fanatics, "I'm no longer going to die on you folks just but. I'm very lucky." The comeback he executed with Cloud 9 in 1987 changed into Not Anything Brief of Great. After years out of the charts, Harrison returned with platinum income and a #1 hit within the US, Got My Mind Set on You. That music, a cowl of a 1962 R&B song, reintroduced him to a new technology. His collaboration with Jeff Lynne made Cloud 9 clean and thrilling, proving Harrison ought to still compete inside the MTV generation. He embraced song videos and When We Become Fab have become a laugh, nostalgic hit packed with Beatles references. In 1988, Harrison helped shape the traveling Wilburys with Bob Dylan, Tom Petty, Jeff Lynne, and Roy Orbison. It started out with one tune, Deal With Care, that changed into just Too True to Waste. In 10 days, they recorded a whole album that became a big achievement. The group's blend of skills and friendship created something magical, although it lasted handiest a short time. Through it all, Harrison stayed real to his religious ideals. He meditated, practiced yoga, and remained a vegetarian from 1968 until his death. He spoke frequently of his search for God and noticed all religions as a part of the same reality. Notwithstanding the repute, he stored his coronary heart targeted on peace, but peace changed into shattered. On December 30, 1999, a person named Michael Abram broke into Harrison's home and stabbed him over 40 instances. Harrison's lung collapsed and he became close to demise. His spouse Olivia fought off the attacker with a lamp and even grabbed his testicles to stop him. Police arrived just in time. Harrison later stated he felt his lifestyles draining away as he lay bleeding. Medical doctors said it became a miracle he survived. The attack left scars deeper than the injuries. Eric Clapton stated Harrison became never the same. He became withdrawn and the trauma seemed to break the calm he had worked so hard to locate. No longer lengthy after, his cancer back. Keith Richards believed that the assault weakened Harrison a lot, that he could not fight off the disease. Harrison exceeded away on November 29, 2001 at age 58. Surrounded by means of his family and listening to sitar's song, he left the world in peace. His ashes were scattered inside the river Ganges as he had needed. His very last message changed into easy and real. Life is fragile like a raindrop on a lotus leaf.